Let's start with the U.S.-China relationship. As I say, the China says they're going to cut their tariffs, which is a step forward. The President Trump has really pursued a bilateral approach to trade. It almost has replaced what we had since World War II. How do you assess the effectiveness of President Trump in the trade arena?
Well, I mean, as a trade expert, and not on a political ground, my own view, for what it's worth, is that Trump's trade policy do not work. Imposing tariffs on imports, which is what he believes he should do in order to reduce the U.S. trade deficit, which he believes is the problem, is all wrong. A, because the U.S. trade deficit is not the problem. When you have the dollar as a currency, you don't have a problem with your trade deficit. And second, because this will not reduce the U.S. trade deficit, especially if he imposes tariffs on China. What is produced in China and imported by the U.S. will be produced elsewhere, mostly outside the U.S., and the price for tariffs will be paid, is being paid by U.S. consumers, and this is a negative development for the U.S. economy. So overall, I don't think it works. I think it's already showing that it doesn't work, and the fact that China has given a $200 billion present to President Trump for his re-election campaign will not change that.
Staying with China for a moment, Mr. Lamy, how do you assess the possible effects on global trade of the coronavirus?
I mean, there's one thing where I agree with Trump on trade, which is that the rules of international trade, the disciplines of the World Trade Organization, do not discipline enough a number of Chinese practices, and especially on subsidization. The Chinese have too wide a margin of maneuver within existing disciplines of the WTO to subsidize production, hence gain an unfair comparative advantage when you compete with them. So on this, I think there is a good US point, which, by the way, is also a point made by the EU or by Japan, that World Trade Organization needs to be reformed in order to adjust to the size and the behavior of China today. This is why the solution is in a reinforcement, in a renegotiation, in an improvement of WTO disciplines, and not in bilateral tariff wars.
We are talking with Pascal Lamy. He's former Director General of the World Trade Organization. Let's stay on the subject of the WTO, which you led for some good long time. President Trump is insisting on reforms to the WTO and has made various threats, I think I can call it, if they don't reform. Does he have a point that there is reform that is required?
As I just said, I think the US have a point, and President Trump has a point in saying that the WTO needs reform. Remember last time we tried to reform WTO, and I was the WTO DG at the time. We had a big negotiation with a WTO reform agenda, and the ones that froze this negotiation about WTO reform, including on subsidies at the time, were the United States of America, which shows that it's easier said than done, that WTO needs reform. I agree with that. Getting there will need many countries to make more concessions in order to have wider disciplines, including probably the US. Of course China, of course Europe, of course India, but also the US, notably on the subsidization of farming.
And we're talking with Pascal Lamy. He's former Director General of the WTO. Let me talk about one specific issue, Mr. Lamy, that has come to light here in the United States, which is the government purchasing agreement, which has been in effect since the 70s, I believe. It is a plurilateral agreement, as I understand it. It does not include all WTO members. The United States has been a member since the 70s. There are reports the administration is considering pulling out of that, pulling the United States out of that, so it would no longer exempt people from the Buy America Act. What would be the effects of that?
Well, as you rightly said, there is an agreement within the WTO, which is only among some members of WTO, roughly developing countries, EU, Japan, Canada, Australia, US, which opens on a reciprocity basis public procurement. I open my public procurement market in a certain proportion, and you open your public procurement market in a certain proportion. We have to negotiate to make sure the proportion is right, and when it is right, we do the deal. This is a deal that was done between the US and other countries. The country that pulls out from this government procurement loses access to the government procurement market of the other members of this club. So it's a club. You're a member of the club, you have to open your public procurement, and you benefit from the public procurement opening of others. You leave the club, you lose the market access you've negotiated.